This is a reading of Written in Bone, Buried Lives in Jamestown by Sally Walker. This is Chapter 8, Part 1. Expect the unexpected. The picture on page 108 says, cobblestones caught the eye of Darren Lowry at what came to be known as Harley Knoll. They told him the site might have been a cemetery. Archaeologists used ribbons to label the stones. On page 109, you notice it says Harley Knoll, located across the Chesapeake Bay and north of St. Mary's City, looked like anything but a burial place. It was overgrown with trees and grasses and surrounded by a small creek. The text says, in 1659, 8 years before the priests of St. Mary's City built the brick chapel under which the lead coffin people were eventually buried, Maryland's colonial government granted a parcel of land to an Englishman named Thomas Taylor, described in the historical record as a gentleman. Taylor established a tobacco plantation on the site, which is located north of St. Mary's City across the Chesapeake Bay. Although little is known of him, historians do know that over the next 100 years, the land was farmed by subsequent owners who grew tobacco, corn, and apples. Later, during the 1900s, the property was given the name Harley by the people who lived there. In 2004, Maryland archaeologist Darren Lowry was trekking along the ridge of a low hill near a tidal creek on the Harley property. His eyes were caught by something peculiar, a large number of cobblestones placed about the hill's ridge. From his studies of geology of the area, Lowry knew that the hill had been formed thousands of years earlier when winds had swept very fine silt and sand, mounding it into a knoll about 15 feet or 4 6/10 meter high. While the wind had been strong enough to carry fine sand, it certainly couldn't have carried the cobblestones that Lowry had seen. Each one looked as if it weighed a couple of pounds, 9/10 kilogram. But Lowry was sure he had seen similarly arranged cobblestones somewhere else. Finally, he remembered. The cobblestones he had seen had been in a colonial cemetery. They had been used as grave markers, but the knoll wasn't near a church or any sort of building at all. It was out in the country, surrounded by trees, grasses, and the meandering tidal creek. Could this little knoll be a graveyard? Doug Olsley and his team of archaeologists, along with a group of Maryland students and teachers whom he had specially trained for the task, were called in to investigate. For archaeological purposes, the site was given the name Harley Knoll, given that the historical records show that the land had been granted to a colonist during the 17th century. Olsley hoped to locate graves belonging to people who had lived during that period. Still, since very little was known about Harley Knoll area, he alerted his team to be on the lookout for the unexpected. As archaeologist Dana Coleman recalled, Olsley advised us that surprises were a possibility. First, the site was gridded and mapped, and archaeologist Laurie Burgess then ground-penetrating radar was used to identify potential burials. The GPR revealed that the knoll contained 35 underground features spaced at regular intervals from one another, many of which were the right size for graves. Some of the underground features were located close to the cobbles that Darren Lowry had observed. Since GPR can't create an identifiable image of a buried object, the team couldn't conclusively declare that the features were graves. Still, the GPR evidence pointed strongly in that direction. In On page 110, the picture says William Hanna to the right and John Imlay to the left dragged a ground-penetrating radar, GPR, antenna across Harley Knoll. The echoes from the radar indicate where buried objects such as coffins might lie. And on page 111, it says work crews removed dirt above and sifted the soil below of 12 different spots on Harley Knoll. The first discoveries. The landowner gave the team permission to excavate 12 of the suspected features. Each feature was assigned to an archaeologist who directed the excavation and a work crew. The dirt removed from the potential grave shafts was sifted through mesh screens to catch any artifacts that it might contain. Digging in the fine sand was easy, but maintaining the high standards of precision that characterized the work of Olsley and his team was not. At archaeological sites with soil that is loamy or contains clay, it's easy to have straight, clean walls, sides of an excavated shaft, exclaimed Burgess. Sandy deposits at Harley Knoll made straight side walls impossible to maintain. The soil had a texture that was like fine sugar. As the crew excavated, it became clear that the soil had not lain undisturbed for several hundred years. It was crisscrossed with stains left by twisting tree roots that had grown down into the soil, then died and decomposed. Other stains showed that animals had disturbed the soil by digging burrows. Soon, several of the crews began to uncover fragile pieces of wood. The shapes of the pieces, the soil stain patterns around them, and the presence of rust-covered nails told the team that they had found the remains of coffins. Harley Knoll site was indeed a cemetery. Because wood decomposes fairly quick in the Chesapeake area, it is rare to find wood remains of colonial coffins. The Knoll's fine sandy soil was the key to preservation in this case. Water drains through sand quickly, so coffins buried in the knoll hadn't rested in moist soil for long periods of time. The elated team members bagged samples of the wood for laboratory analysis and placed brightly colored markers in the exact spots and positions of the nails to record their locations. The markers were photographed in situ to create a permanent record so that the archaeologists would know how the separate parts of each coffin, the sides, the headboard, the footboard, and the lid, had been nailed together. As excavations proceeded, archaeologist Dale Brown encountered a strange situation at the grave designated as Harley Knoll Burial 9, HK9. Carrie Brulahide had began working at the head of the grave and Brown at the foot. They were soon confronted with a puzzle. The coffin Wood Brown was exposing near the foot lay at a strange angle in relation to the long piece of wood Brulahide was uncovering at the other end. The pieces should have been parallel, facing the same direction. Instead, one piece was turned. The archaeologists knew that colonial coffins were not constructed in this pattern. What could the explanation be? Before the team could solve this mystery, Brown encountered a second oddity. As he brushed the soil from the remnants of the coffin lid, he found an oyster shell in the area that would have been the top of the coffin, right in the center. It turned out to be the only shell found at Harley Knoll that was associated with a grave. Had it fallen atop the coffin naturally as the grave shaft was filled in, or had a relative or friend placed it there in honor of the deceased person? Memory. We may never know the answer. Brulahide did, however, find the answer to the first puzzle. The wood that she uncovered lay at a strange angle to Brown's wood because it belonged to another coffin, a very small one. The shaft held not one coffin, but two. Brulahide excavated the small coffin and immediately identified the bones as those of a human infant. The remains, labeled as HK9A, were photographed and removed for further study in the laboratory. On page 112, you'll notice the picture's caption says, Crawley Brulahide on top and Dale Brown on the bottom work on burial 9. The exposed bone belonging to HK9. On page 113, it says the oyster shell on top found in one of the graves continues to puzzle researchers. Meanwhile, Brulahide brushed soil from the skull of the infant labeled HK9A on the left. Soon the team was able to view the body's entire skeleton on the right.